Nova is nature. Nova is science. Nova is adventure. Nova is the award-winning series that brings the wonders of the world home on video. Featuring 32 volumes in total, the Nova videos make important additions to every video library. Discover the latest in technological advances. Enter new worlds of science and nature. Voyage to places you've never been before. And gain fascinating new insights about our past, present, and future. Collect all of the exciting editions of Nova. Nova, the series that brings the wonders of the world home on video.
Daybreak in Africa, home still to the world's greatest concentrations of wildlife. As the light grows, the stunning variety of animals that graces the continent sets about the daily business of living. For many of us, it is the elephant, largest of all land mammals, that draws our attention from the general spectacle. As different as they are from humans in appearance, there is much about them that feels familiar.
I think that one of the reasons that we find elephants so special is that they have many of the qualities that we like best in ourselves. They are very compassionate, they have extremely strong bonds, very close friendships. They're very loyal to one another. They have a lot of trust, and then they're also very powerful, have a lot of strength.
Joyce Poole is one of a small group of researchers who have devoted their lives to studying the African elephant. Her insights into elephant behavior have helped shape our understanding and appreciation of these remarkable beasts. Recently, she was named Director of Elephant Conservation for the Kenya Wildlife Service.
I've spent 15 years watching elephants. They are incredibly intelligent animals. I would rank them up probably with whales and dolphins and chimps and gorillas, probably just below that group. Elephants have family relationships that are like human relationships. They live in family units that are made up of related sisters, mothers, daughters, aunts, nieces, and those bonds last a lifetime. I would even say that those bonds are closer than mother-daughter human relationships. Those mothers and daughter elephants stay together for, 45, 50 years. I find that elephants have a real sense of self, a real sense of themselves as being very large and sometimes rather funny animals. They have a real sense of humor. Elephants will do things, and you can tell by the expressions on their faces and the way they move that they do think that they are very funny. What they are doing is very funny, and that isn't something that you see in a lot of other animals.
Elephants also have a previously unsuspected capacity to communicate. Recent research has shown that elephants use low-frequency vocalizations that are out of the range of human hearing to talk to other elephants as far as 6 miles away. Insights such as these have enhanced the elephant's stature as one of nature's special creations and made all the more shocking the realization that the elephant's days might be numbered. Throughout the 1980s, 2,000 elephants a week were killed. They were murdered for their ivory teeth, their tusks hacked from their faces. Their bodies were left to rot in the sun, grim monuments to greed and thoughtless exploitation. It was for trinkets like these, and these, and these, that hundreds of thousands of elephants lost their lives. Though poaching plagued the entire continent, it hit hardest at East Africa, reaching crisis proportions in Kenya, which began in the 1980s with over 55,000 elephants. Kenya had but 16,000 at the decade's close. Like many of its neighbors, Kenya did not immediately recognize the size of the threat posed by ivory poaching. With the world's fastest-growing human population, a limited manufacturing sector, few minerals, and lots of poverty, the Kenyan government's attention was focused elsewhere. Yet as the problem intensified, it became clear poaching had the potential to affect the entire nation. Kenya has long been considered one of the world's premier wildlife haunts, with over 50 national parks and game reserves. The parks attract tourists, and tourist dollars have become essential to Kenya's national economy. As poaching escalated, the fear grew that if the elephants disappeared, the tourists would too. And yet it seemed there was little that could be done.
The price of ivory was going out at such a phenomenal rate that there would be nothing to stop the poacher trying to get at the elephant. Any poacher who could get hold of a pair of tusks was gaining the equivalent of 1 to 2 years' salary. Now that meant that he could make a fortune in 6 months. More and more gangs were established to go out and kill the remaining elephants. And a very careful analysis of what was driving the demand indicated that it was the wealth in Asia, and ultimately in Europe and America too, and the poverty in Africa juxtaposed, that was going to drive the elephant to extinction.
The money to be made from ivory was so great, it even threatened the integrity of the Kenyan government. Park rangers, eager to supplement their meager salaries, were tempted into killing animals they were supposed to protect. Senior government officials and their families became involved in poaching and smuggling scandals. The problems created by the illegal ivory trade were not unique to Kenya. They were echoed across all of Africa. As the decade grew to a close, it was clear no African nation working alone could control the trade or stop the slaughter.
What will we tell our children? That for a few bracelets, a few bangles, the elephant was exterminated? Americans buy 1/3 of the world's ivory jewelry.
In the late 80s, a worldwide campaign was mounted to try to stop the killing.
Only elephants should wear ivory.
At rallies in Europe and the U.S., protesters of all ages demanded the international community ban the ivory trade. In May of 1989, famed paleontologist Richard Leakey was chosen to head a reorganized Kenya Wildlife Service. Leakey had openly criticized Kenya's failure to control poaching and the corruption it spawned. His appointment was seen as a sign that Kenya intended to get serious about its elephant crisis. Less than 3 months later, the task took on heightened urgency as tourists got caught in the crossfire.
The Kenya government is very aware and very concerned about our ability to maintain a steady flow of hard currency through the tourist industry. Once the tour operators began to show that they were losing numbers and that the flow would realistically be expected to go down if this killing of elephants continued, then I think action was much more easily planned and taken.
To dramatize the situation, Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi set fire to a mountain of confiscated ivory valued at over $3 million. With this symbolic gesture, Kenya declared its willingness to sacrifice to save the elephant. But what about the rest of the world? Were other nations willing to stop the buying and selling of ivory that was driving the poaching problem? In January of 1990, the UN-sponsored Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, known as CITES, met in Lausanne, Switzerland. After days of rancorous debate, the members voted to ban for 2 years all trade in elephant products. To the East Africans and their supporters in the international conservation community, it appeared the world had recognized an evil and decided to do something about it. But not everyone agreed. A number of southern African countries, most notably Botswana and Zimbabwe, had fought hard against the ban. They promptly announced plans to continue trading ivory, which was their right under CITES. This announcement was greeted with dismay by ban supporters.
If I have my way, the legal trade in ivory will disappear totally. I do not want to see a legal trade in ivory re-establish itself ever. I personally believe that the elephant can never be secure for so long as there is a legal trade in ivory.
In southern Africa, however, the ivory ban is not seen as a way to save the elephant. Rather, Zimbabwe and many of its neighbors see it as something that will hasten the elephant's disappearance. Zimbabwe is a country of 9 million people, 3 out of 4 of whom live outside urban areas. It is a country with limited natural resources, and like much of Africa, its population is growing faster than its ability to produce food. In an increasingly competitive world economy, Zimbabwe's options for producing the wealth that could improve the lives of its people are severely limited. 40% of the country is owned communally. Millions who live in the communal lands depend on subsistence farming. Dembura Mola is one of 30,000 people living in the Nyami Nyami district of northwest Zimbabwe. He and his wives coax from the ground sorghum, maize, and peanuts. It's not easy, but the soils here are poor, the rainfall low and erratic. Still, Mola and his family do reasonably well by local standards. Many Nyami Nyami children suffer from malnutrition and have had to rely on famine relief programs in recent years. For everyone in this district, the presence of wild animals like buffalo, lion, and elephant makes a hard life harder. There are 2,500 elephants in Nyami Nyami. In addition, some 7,000 live on nearby Matusadana National Park. These animals frequently wander out of the park onto Nyami Nyami land.
What actually happens in those communal areas around national parks is that people leave their villages at the start of the planting season and start living in their fields to guard their fields against these large animals. And basically, when an elephant attempts to get into someone's field, they make lots of noise, use tin cans or whatever, try and scare the elephants away from the field. Of course, this is not always successful, and sometimes people have actually lost their lives. The elephants just get angry and kill these people, crush them to death or something. And when the people take their crop out of the field into the barns at home, elephants will still come back to these homes and attempt to destroy these barns to get at the crops. So it's really a situation whereby some people actually lose a whole crop before they are able to harvest it. And some people lose all of their harvest to these elephants.
To anyone who asks, Dembura Mola is ready to express his feelings about wildlife. On this afternoon, he is recounting for Elliot Nabula, the district's wildlife officer, past occasions when his fields have been raided by elephant and buffalo. He's also describing where, if the money could be found, he would build fences to keep the animals away. For Nabula, complaints about wild animals are an almost daily occurrence.
Percent 4% alpha. Roger, good morning. Confirm was set. Morning, Roger. Confirm, is there any item Babambon problem animal at all?
More often than not, Nabula's day begins with a radio survey of crop damage reports. On this morning, a marauding elephant was reported to be lingering in a nearby district. The farmer whose fields had been trampled believed it to be the same elephant that had killed his son just 2 weeks before.
They just walked into this elephant bull and saw the animal. It was so close, so they had to keep it. As they were running away, they all took different directions. And this son, he was, detected by the animal, so it just went for him and it killed him.
At this moment, this villager can see but one way of easing his pain: shoot the offending animal. At least then he could share in the meat that would be distributed. Yet even if Nabula could find the elephant, which in this instance he could not, his goal would be to drive it off.
At this stage, he feels that we just have to probably shoot the animals, because in the past they were shot on sight. But at this stage, he was sort of trying to tell them that they've got to conserve.
They've got to conserve because now, for the first time in generations, the people of Nyami Nyami have a stake in the region's wildlife. For thousands of years, Africans saw wildlife as part of the bounty of nature. In the colonial era, however, the Africans' freedom to use both animals and the land was seriously curtailed.
The original colonial motive for colonizing Zimbabwe, northern and southern Rhodesia, as it were then, was to get gold, an extension of the rand. But when they failed to get gold in these anticipated quantities, the white colonialists then moved into farming. Now, to make way for the white settler farmers, they had to remove African farmers from prime agricultural land and move them off into marginal land. At the same time, they had to create labor for the new white settler farms. And to do that, they had to move these Africans to areas with less potential so that they could reduce their potential to compete against European agriculture.
To make it even harder for Africans to survive without working as laborers, colonial administrations across Africa banned Africans from hunting. This was justified on the grounds that all wildlife was property of the state.
And the Africans, who have traditionally been hunters for purposes of getting meat, hides, or even ivory, are now excluded from enjoying these benefits. So that what starts to happen really is that people are being prosecuted if they attempt to utilize the game in their areas. So people are alienated from wildlife.
Africans were further alienated from wildlife when colonial governments in Africa began creating national parks and game reserves. These were designed to preserve wildlife, a worthy goal given the slaughter wrought by white hunters and traders. Unfortunately, little thought was given to the effect of all this on the African. In the intervening years, the antagonism between people and animals that lingers as a legacy of colonialism has intensified as they compete more directly for land on which to live.
We're a third world country. There's a lot of poverty here. Why should rural communities, they do not have the resources in the first place, why should they conserve wildlife? Often they see it as a pest that destroys crops, that destroys livestock, and is a danger to human life. But if they perceive it as contributing to their economic life, then they will conserve it.
To make it possible for people in communal areas like Nyami Nyami to benefit from the presence of wildlife, Zimbabwe has given them the right to manage and utilize the animals on their land. Through the National Parks Department's Campfire program, local wildlife management districts are being established all over the country. This is a group from Ngandi, part of the Nyami Nyami district. This meeting, like many others since the district became part of Campfire, revolves around wildlife management issues. Districts participating in the Campfire program are free, within sustainable limits, to use wildlife to meet community needs. Problem animals, those that have repeatedly raided crops or endangered lives, are shot and the meat is distributed among local villages. With elephants, tusks, skins, and tails are sold, and the profits shared.
The Campfire program is basically offering to involve people in the management of wildlife as well as the benefits of wildlife utilization. So it is attempting to redress the colonial situation where people are alienated from both the management and the revenues or whatever benefits are accrued from wildlife exploitation.
Far and away, the largest chunk of revenue coming to the district comes from big game hunters. Many hunters, like Englishman Tim Hammond, believe their sport is totally consistent with the goals of wildlife conservation. At the very least, killing animals for sport is a controversial way to conserve them. And when the animal is an elephant, emotions can run high. Zimbabwe has decided the benefits far outweigh the costs.
For one particular elephant bull, we can put together a whole elephant safari from which we earn at least $20,000 US. Now, of that, the large proportion of it can be returned straight back to the community from where the elephant is living. Now, if you think in terms of a community in a rural area, on an average, a household may only earn 200 or 300 Zimbabwe dollars per annum. If you compute the value of that elephant and share it out amongst 100 households, we're talking about maybe doubling their annual income. People are beginning to want to have elephants in the area. If poachers come into the area, they say, hang on, don't poach those things. We actually want those elephants in our area.
Wildlife revenues are typically used, firstly, to compensate people for crop and livestock destruction incurred from that conservation of wildlife. And secondly, it is also invested in the development of social infrastructure, such as schools, roads, clinics, which infrastructure also tends to be lacking in these marginal communal areas that we are talking about because of colonial neglect. At a third level, these revenues can also be distributed to individual households so that it becomes the household's own decision about what they are going to do with the revenue.
This Ngandi ward received $16,000 last year as its share of the district's wildlife utilization earnings. They're debating using some of that money to buy solar-powered electric fencing to protect fields and homes. This ward elected to use its share of last year's earnings to pay cash dividends to every household. This one chose to invest in a grinding mill, a simple technology, but one that will save the women of the ward countless hours of pounding grain by hand. But it's not only on communal lands that the economic potential of wildlife is being explored. Private landowners are also getting involved, making commitments to wildlife conservation and utilization. Buck DeFries settled just outside Wangi National Park 30 years ago. His goal was to raise cattle, but he soon discovered how difficult that can be in an area with abundant wildlife. Elephant and rhino regularly knocked down his fences. Lions, leopards, wild dogs, and hyenas constantly threatened his herd. Many a night was spent out in his fields, gun in hand, trying to protect his stock.
It was a matter of survival. It wasn't, really to kill the animals, but it was a matter of survival. Either you're going to make a living or the wild animals going to eat your profit.
The legislation that made it possible for communal districts to control the wildlife on their land did the same for private landowners. When it passed, DeFries realized his future was not in cattle, but in game. Over a period of years, DeFries sold off most of his cattle and built up his wildlife stock. Since then, he has been selling live animals to zoos and game parks, and selling the opportunity to track and shoot trophy animals to hunters and photographers.
We used to sell a big ox for something like $80, that you got to keep for 3-4 years. Today just a stupid zebra skin is worth something like $800. So you just can't compare it. It's just nothing that you can compare between trying to ranch cattle and ranching game.
You're looking now at 500 commercial farms in the country where wildlife is the major form of land use. In the last 2 years, 11 major rural districts in the country have adopted wildlife as their most significant form of land use. We're starting to watch a situation in Zimbabwe now where domestic livestock is being replaced by wildlife management as a form of land use. The returns from wildlife management are up to or more than $20 per hectare. That sort of money's never been realized from cattle. And it's this exciting trend that we want to see continue. 30% of Zimbabwe is now under wildlife, and we think that there'll be 42% of the country by the turn of the century. Now, that's not happening elsewhere in Africa. And we feel it's because we have decentralized, allowed people to develop wildlife schemes, placed a very high value on wildlife products. A thing like an ivory ban works exactly in the opposite direction to our conservation needs.
For the present, the ban has severely depressed the international ivory market. Hoping to create a market for their own legally obtained ivory, Zimbabwe and neighboring Botswana, Malawi, Zambia, and Namibia plan to hold periodic ivory auctions. They're also exploring a variety of fingerprinting techniques that they hope will assure the world only legally harvested ivory is being sold. In Kenya, on the other hand, it is widely believed there can be no exceptions to the ivory ban if these elephants are to survive.
But I'm quite sure that had the international ban not come into effect, the rate of killing of elephants in Kenya would have gone on pretty much as it was, and we would have lost another 2,000-3,000 elephants by now, which would have put the national herd down to less than 15,000. Some populations would have probably been beyond recall, and I hope that the people of the world will continue to take the ivory trade as a serious issue. If it were to be reopened in a year or two from now, we will probably fail in our attempt to safeguard the elephant herds of Africa.
Richard Leakey does agree with Zimbabwe, however, that if wildlife conservation efforts are to succeed, they must provide rural Africans with economic benefits. The land around Kenyan parks like Amboseli, Tsavo, and Masai Mara is owned by members of the Maasai tribe. Theirs is a traditional lifestyle centered primarily on the raising of cattle and goats. A small but growing number of Maasai are also raising field crops, like these tomatoes. The majority of Maasai, however, still live in huts like the ones their ancestors built, and still build fences of thorns to protect themselves and their livestock from wildlife. Many of the animals that threaten Maasai lives and crops live on the parks, which is a source of some tension because at present the Maasai get little from the parks in return.
We have got to have a system where it's worth the landowner's while to have the wildebeest and the zebra and the elephant moving across his land. This is perfectly possible where you have tourism and where tourism generates revenues and where you are prepared to share revenue derived in the park with the people peripheral to the park whose existence is necessary for the park to survive.
Kenya is blessed with long vistas that make game viewing easy. To this, it has added the infrastructure, hotels, highways, and tourist services that cater to the international traveler. The tourists who visit Kenya every year generate more hard currency for the country than any other industry. Most African countries would be happy to have a tourist industry to rival Kenya's, but for most of them, that's unlikely. Nothing deters a tourist like political instability, and most African countries have had more than their share. Investment capital for resorts is hard to justify when a nation needs schools and hospitals, and not every country is well suited geographically to high-volume tourism.
I often heard the suggestion that a live elephant photographed by thousands of tourists was worth far more to Africa than a dead elephant that had been shot on a once-off basis by the client of a safari operator. And on the surface, that is perfectly logical, and indeed it is true under certain circumstances. A nice big bull elephant roaming on the open plains of Amboseli near to Nairobi clearly demonstrates the truth of that assertion. But if you take a community here in Zimbabwe, down in the Zambezi Valley, where the country is thick bush, an elephant of that type would probably never be seen by a tourist. You certainly couldn't build a tourist industry in those micro habitats. And for those people, the best use of that elephant is to crop it or to utilize it in another way.
In addition, tourism doesn't encourage rural communities to get involved in the process of wildlife management. In Zimbabwe, at least, this is seen as a means of empowerment for people who have extremely limited opportunities to improve their lives.
We've gone through a learning process on this. Perhaps 10 years ago, we thought it was enough to manage wildlife in the communal lands and hand out a few paychecks to the local people and think that that would cause them to appreciate wildlife. We've learnt over those 10 years that's not good enough. An individual who lives in the communal lands has got to be able to build his wildlife husbandry into his own individual annual survival budget. And that really means you do have to let go. You have to say to the man, it's your resource. Manage it how you wish, but we're here to give you technical advice if you want to manage it better.
Zimbabwe's approach to wildlife management has been so effective that in many parts of the country there are simply too many elephants. These elephants live on Hwange National Park in northwestern Zimbabwe. Hwange was created in the 1930s. It comprises 14,000 square kilometers of arid woodland set on the eastern extension of the Kalahari Desert. Over the years, dozens of wells have been drilled to supplement Hwange's meager natural water supplies. As a result, wildlife, including elephant, have flourished here on what would otherwise have been marginal habitat. In the 1930s, there were 3,000 elephant at Hwange. Today, there are over 20,000, enough to change vegetation patterns and threaten biological diversity in the park. Elephants eat up to 18 hours every day, consuming between 100 and 150 pounds of vegetation. They aren't especially fussy eaters. Grasses are a staple, but so are leaves, seed pods, small branches, and the bark of trees. When there are too many elephants around, they can convert a forest into a grassland, with dire consequences for a wide range of other species. In time, elephants will even eat themselves out of house and home and starve.
Now, to conserve woodlands and the whole animal community that goes with woodlands, the birds and those large grazers that like the type of grasses found under mature canopy woodlands, to conserve those things, you need elephant densities that are fairly low, 1 elephant to 4 square kilometers. You certainly will keep a vestige of woodland when you have 1 elephant to 1 square kilometer. But as you start going higher than that, you certainly lose woodlands. You end up with shrublands, and if elephant densities start reaching 3, 4, 5 per square kilometer, then you're into a situation where I believe you're mining the capital out of the ecosystem.
This is essentially what happened at Kenya's Travle National Park in the late 60s and early 70s.
The Travle story epitomizes the dilemmas we face with elephants. You see, by the early 1960s, the elephants in the region around the park were being crowded into the park. The park was 8,000 square miles. That's the size of Vermont. It was a big place. But the total unit that the elephants needed was twice as big. Human encroachment backed the elephants into the park. And a number of scientists, myself included, said, well, these elephants are overgrazing their vegetation. They'll eat themselves out of house and home. It'll be bad news for the entire park. But the park warden and 1 or 2 other scientists said, no, this is a park. We shall leave nature to run its own course. They didn't recognize it was an unnatural situation.
In the early 70s, a drought hit. What vegetation hadn't been eaten withered and died. Soon after, the elephants began to die, too. Within a year, over 10,000 elephants and countless other animals had starved. Yet equally severe was the impact upon the park's relations with the people who lived nearby.
The drought that had caused this elephant crash, together with their previous history, was also affecting human communities outside the park who were also starving and in some cases dying. They looked over the park boundary and saw those big mountains of good meat, elephant meat, being left to the hyenas, and they were told by the park warden you cannot have 1 single forkful of all that meat because it's a park. You can imagine how those people now view Travle Park 20 years later. According to people I've talked with in bars around that park, they are still waiting for the day when they can abolish that park altogether because of the way that it was presented to them at the time of their great need. You see, in the early 1970s, we had a problem of dying elephants, dying people. If we put those 2 problems together, we could have had one real pretty good solution, especially if we'd cropped the elephants ahead of time. Much more merciful way for them to go, much better for the park, much better for the local people, much better on all kinds of fronts. Today, the elephant numbers are way, way down because of all the poaching, but sooner or later, their numbers will bounce up if ever we get rid of the damn poachers, and then we'll be faced with the same old problem. What do we do when we get too many elephants?
Zimbabwe's elephant herd has doubled in the past 25 years to 60,000 animals. That's almost twice what National Parks Department scientists consider the optimum herd size for the country. Ecologist Mike Jones and botanist Kathy Martin work at Hwangee. It's their job to monitor changes in park vegetation that might indicate a shift in the ecological balance that has been established here.
This really dark stuff would have been the acacia, and perhaps this was teak, and this bit in here is teak.
Yeah, and I think that's still there.
It's that teak that's still there. All that acacia woodland's gone.
Yeah. This is the 83.
Yeah.
This is the 60, is it? 59.
Yeah. There's been about a 50% change. There's almost nothing left.
There's virtually nothing left.
Yeah.
In that area.
Any changes they're seeing now would have been far more dramatic if Hwangee's managers hadn't decided some time ago to control the number of animals living in the park.
The grassland.
If we had the means of translocating them to Kenya or to any other country, we would do it. But because the elephant is so bulky, you can't do it. We have to kill it in order to reduce the numbers to manageable levels, in order to protect the food source of the very same animals that we want to protect.
It's a human-made problem. It's not the elephant's fault. We've backed them into a corner where there's not enough room for them to live. We have to reduce their numbers within the carrying capacity of their habitats. And that's, I'll say it in so many words, we kill off the excess. We kill large wild animals inside protected areas. And I say, I have 1,000 voices inside my head saying, don't talk such rubbish. But we've set up this problem. Only we can unset it up. And we've got to go and do it, even though we'll have blood on our hands. We went around in a helicopter to crowd the elephants into a little tight bunch. We came down on the ground. The 2 riflemen got out with their guns, tiptoed up in the face of the wind. The rule is that you get as close to an elephant and then 10 yards closer before you start to shoot. The leading gunman finally said, well, if everybody's ready, I'm going to start. And he started firing, his fellow started firing. And from silence in that savannah, there was suddenly uproar. And I thought for 6 months afterwards, isn't there a better way we can do things than this? This is disgrace. But I fear there is no other way. We've backed ourselves into a corner where we have to do things like that, dreadful as it sounds.
Zimbabwe takes a position that it must cull elephants if it is to maintain biological diversity in its national parks. The animals that are culled are treated as a resource to benefit local people. Every animal culled is immediately skinned and butchered. A full-grown elephant can provide 1,000 kilograms of prime meat. Dried, this valuable source of protein can remain edible for up to a year. The government has also realized economic benefits from elephant culling by marketing elephant skins and ivory.
Wildlife utilization, the economic activities associated with wildlife contribute approximately 200 million Zimbabwean dollars, which amounts are poured back into our conservation efforts. Obviously, with the ban, this will reduce the amounts of money that go into our conservation. In Zimbabwe, our elephant head has increased from 12,000 to about 61,000 now, because our conservation strategy is based on effective utilization of wildlife as an economic resource.
To its supporters, the Zimbabwean approach is straightforward, pragmatic, and successful. To its detractors, it is cold and unfeeling, even immoral.
And basically, it's a question of the philosophy of conservation. What are we trying to save? What are we trying to do? And I believe we should be trying in every possible case to save naturally functioning ecosystems. I don't think I agree with the Southern African stand, which is to more or less to save numbers, representative numbers of elephants or habitats or tree species or whatever. And then they call that conservation. But you see, I call that farming or ranching. I don't call that conservation. I would rather see no elephants than elephants being culled. And that's an extreme position, but that is the position I've come to hold, just because I think it is morally unjustified to kill elephants and to treat them like so many mice and just cull off what you think shouldn't be there. They're too intelligent, they live too complicated lives for us to treat them that way.
Unfortunately, with fast-growing human populations, there are only a few areas in Africa large enough to even consider letting the elephant live completely free of human interference. If these were the only places elephants could be found, the world would have many fewer elephants. Moreover, populations of other species, which depend on the elephant for habitat maintenance, would also decline. With fewer animals around, the economic potential of wildlife for Africa, either through tourism or hunting or the sale of meat, hides, and ivory, will also decline. Most everyone agrees, wherever possible, efforts should be made to preserve truly wild populations of elephants. But it may be too much to expect that this can be the fate of more than a small minority of these animals.
We can set aside a certain amount of land where there is no question of financial returns being important. The long-term conservation is everything. But that certain amount of land may be no more than 20,000 square kilometers. The remainder of our unsettled state land under wildlife will have to pay for itself, and it may even in the end have to subsidize the special protected areas.
I think it's extremely likely that the elephant numbers will increase quite dramatically in the next decade. And I think we have to anticipate this increase and recognize that it is going to bring problems.
With other species, wildebeest, impala, buffalo, Richard Leakey is willing to cull, but culling elephant populations has a political cost neither Leakey nor Kenya are prepared to pay.
We've been active in promoting a concern for elephants and popularizing the emotional side of conservation as it pertains to elephant survival. And I don't see how we, having taken a lead role, could legitimately abandon our supporters a decade from now and say, well, now we're going to kill these animals because we got too many. And I think people would quite rightly say, well, what happened to their social patterns and their family structure and the little ones and the old ones, the sick ones? And we're not operating in a political vacuum, we're operating in an international community, and Kenya would get very bad press if we were to take a position diametrically opposed to our present stance.
But the question remains, what do you do when you have too many elephants? Because of poaching, Kenya hasn't faced this issue since Tsavo 20 years ago. But now, Amboseli National Park is showing signs of overcrowding. The challenge for Kenya is to find alternatives to culling. One possibility, would be to get the Maasai that live just outside Amboseli's borders to tolerate more elephants on their land. The Kenya Wildlife Service plans to give the Maasai 25% of Amboseli's gate receipts. If the Maasai accept this as adequate compensation, then ways can be explored for driving the animals out of the park. David Western has devised one possible approach.
Our idea is that elephants have become so concentrated into these tiny swamps on which they depend that if we force a drought by closing them off with electric fences, we can re-establish the migrations of elephants in this area outside, and that would preempt any need to cull elephants in our estimation. Starting at about 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 10, we have 3 wires driven by a solar electric panel turning out 5,000 to 7,000 volts. Now that's enough to give an elephant an enormous jolt and enough to knock most people on the ground. So by setting up a small electric fence, we can create an artificial drought which will drive the elephants back out of the park sooner than they would otherwise be driven by a natural drought.
This scheme is designed to increase the range of Amboseli's elephants. If it works, it could buy the park some time, but the day will come when there are more elephants here than the land can sustain. Richard Leakey is hoping for a longer-term solution.
I personally believe that the introduction of some form of contraception, the interference with the female reproductive cycle, possibly the male, is one way that we should explore. I think just because it hasn't been done and nobody's got the solution around the corner doesn't mean it can't be done and won't be done. I believe it's an option that is well worth exploring and an option that we intend to explore, and we will put money into this program over the next few years because I think it is likely to be a very important way forward.
Elephant contraception will take time to develop. When and if it's introduced, there will still be questions about whether it can be administered to huge migrating populations of wild animals. Assuming controls on the illegal trade in ivory remain effective, there's reason to believe the elephant will not be threatened with extinction anytime soon. It's also clear that the elephant's future is very much tied to the future of rural Africans.
We're living in Africa, and there's a lot of poverty, and people are not going to be willing to have elephants around if they can barely survive themselves. You know, we're going to have to decide where people are happy living with elephants and where they're not happy with living with elephants. There are people who just close their eyes to the problem and say, yes, we want elephants in the world. It's unethical to kill elephants, we want elephants, and that's that. And then there are the people who just see the other side. People who just have them stamping on their crops. People who make $6 a month and are trying to survive. It's a balance between the two, and it's very hard.
In the past 30 years, the face of rural Africa has changed dramatically. Where once there were islands of human settlement in a sea of wild lands, there are today islands of wildlife in a sea of humanity.
We've tried to play Noah. We've found our ark is miserably too small. It's absurdly too small. And as a result, we are now playing God. We don't realize that for the most part. You don't hear wildlife scientists or park wardens or wildlife directors saying that. That's what it amounts to. We are determining which species shall live on this planet with us and which, in effect, shall be put over the side of the boat. Now, we're not doing it deliberately. I wish we would do it deliberately because we cannot avoid the responsibility for what we are doing, which is playing God. And we give hardly a thought to how to play God.
Travle.